Edward Estlin E. Cummings was born October 14, 1894 in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
He started writing poems as early as 1904, while enrolled in the Cambridge Latin High School.
By 1916, he had received both his BA and MA from Harvard University, graduating magna cum laude.
He would go on to receive various awards for both his prose and poetry, including Dial Award, 1925, Guggenheim Fellowship, 1933 and 1951, Shelley Memorial Award for Poetry, 1944, Fellowship of American Academy of Poets, 1950, Bollingen Prize in Poetry, 1958, among others.
Shortly after his graduation, Cummings published an early selection of poems in the anthology 8 Harvard Poets. That same year, Cummings would volunteer abroad in France as a volunteer ambulance driver. He would recount his experience in his novel, The Enormous Room, after being detained in a French prison camp under the suspicion of espionage. His studies at Harvard introduced him to the poetry of avant-garde writers, the likes of Gertrude Stein and Ezra Pound. And after the war, Cummings would divide his time between his summer home, Joy Farm in New Hampshire, and Greenwich Village. During this time, he also frequently traveled throughout Europe, familiarizing himself with many poets and artists, particularly Pablo Picasso, whose work he especially admired.
In 1920, Dial published 7 poems by Cummings, including Buffalo Bills, serving as Cummings' debut to a wider American audience.
These experiments foreshadowed the synthetic cubist strategy Cummings would explore in the next few years. In his work, Cummings experimented radically with the form, punctuation, spelling, and syntax, abandoning traditional techniques and structures to create a new, highly idiosyncratic means of poetic expression.
An example of this is in his poem Buffalo Bills.
Buffalo Bills, defunct, who used to ride a water-smooth silver stallion and break 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pigeons just like that. Jesus, he was a handsome man. And what I want to know is, how do you like your blue-eyed boy, Mr. Death?
This poem is an expression of respect towards the heroic personality of the man himself, William Cody, the deceased hero. However, Cummings is also satirizing the traditional heroism of killing the armless and harmless animals with guns, from a distance, leaving room for the reader to interpret the piece.
The noise in this writing is the large amount of spaces and non-spaces between the words and lines, giving certain sections shapes for readers to interpret.
For example, the section with "and a break" and "Jesus" forms the shape of a gun, giving the poem a bit more of a threatening feel. The poem begins with the news of the hero's death, but the word defunct is unusually inappropriate. Defunct means no longer operating, functioning, or being used, as in the case of a machine or a law. This is unsympathetic.
Maybe heroism has died with the hero. Cody died in 1917, so the poem, first published in 1920, is a kind of obituary for this fallen figure. He is remembered fondly by the speaker, almost as if the speaker is remembering his childhood pleasure in watching Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. The adult speaker, however, is wondering what Buffalo Bill's legacy really is.
Despite the fact that this style of writing worked for Cummings, later in his career many would criticize him for settling with this signature style and not working towards further evolution.
Regardless, he would still achieve great popularity for the simplicity of his language, playful tone, and his attention to subjects such as war and sex.
Cummings was married briefly twice, though his longest relationship was outside marriage.
Cummings' first marriage to Elaine Orr began as a love affair in 1918, while she was married to Schofield Thayer, one of Cummings' friends from Harvard. It is said that during this time, he wrote a good deal of his erotic poetry.
Take his poem I Will Wait Out, otherwise entitled Crepuscule.
I will wade out till my thighs are steeped in burning flowers. I will take the sun in my mouth and leap into ripe air, alive, with eyes closed to dash against darkness. In the sleeping curves of my body shall enter fingers of smooth mastery, with chastenest of sea girls. I will complete the mystery of my flesh. I will rise after 1,000 years lipping flowers and set my teeth into the silver of the moon.
Cummings' poem has to do with deciding what type of person and what type of life one wants to live.
Take the physical structure of the poem. The lines are indented in and out like the waves of the ocean. This type of spontaneous and random motion follows that of a few other of his poems, such as "Oh Sweet Spontaneous" and "Let's Live Without Thinking."
E Cummings had transcendental influences which are retreated into nature in this poem. The sun is symbolic of death and rebirth, evolution and divine. The moon is described as a timepiece, personified as a deity, which in some cultures is associated with insanity and irrationality.
All of these representations of nature could be connected with the evolution of self and of one's soul.
There are also a few instances of very visual and oxymoronic objects. For instance, burning flowers and sleeping curves. The burning flowers represent destroying beauty. A flower is a very delicate and gentle object. However, burning is a very violent, strong, and destructive action.
In addition, curves connotate movement, action, winding, and instability, while sleeping is non-active, without movement. This juxtaposition goes along with the sense of uncertainty in waiting and wavering and possibly not knowing what you want out of life. Despite Cummings' familiarity with avant-garde styles, much of his work is quite traditional. Many of his poems are sonnets, albeit often with a modern twist, and he occasionally made use of the blues form and acrostics.
In addition, a number of Cummings' poems feature, in part or in whole, intentional misspellings, and several incorporate phonetic spellings intended to represent particular dialects.
Cummings died of a stroke on September 3, 1962 at the age of 67 in North Conway, New Hampshire at the Memorial Hospital.
He is remembered by many of his works, including The Enormous Room, 1922, Tulips and Chimneys, 1923, the avant-garde play Hymn, 1927, erotic poems, the early poems of E Cummings, as well as fairy tales.